Hey, I'm Matt Manny. Thanks so much for joining me for session number 3. Go ahead and take out your session study guide and turn to page number 49. Page 49 in your session study there. Session 3, we're looking at the door of generosity, how to help the poor. Proverbs 14 verse 31 says this: "Those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but helping the poor honors him." When it comes to this topic of compassion, one of the most complicated and guilty scenarios that I struggle with, and I think many of us struggle with, is the classic scenario of when you see somebody who is panhandling or begging for some money, or who you see looks like they may be homeless. How do you respond? We quickly try not to judge a book by its cover, but for many of us, we can't help but try to size a person up and see, is this somebody who truly is in need? Is this somebody who's a threat? Is this somebody who is trying to scam me or to con me? And in our society, it's so easy for us to be able to put up the walls and the barriers and to rationalize our way out of compassion, especially when it comes to this issue of talking about helping those in poverty. If you didn't get a chance to go ahead and read the session introduction, there's lots of great stats in there. We talk about the 3 different common types of poverty: extreme poverty, relative poverty, and situational poverty. And if you haven't read that yet, I would encourage you to go ahead and stop the video and take a look at that. As well, if you haven't read our scripture for today from Matthew chapter 5 verse 3, and then as well James chapter 2 is where we're going to spend most of our time today, talking about James, the half-brother of Jesus, who was also the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. He had some very strong words to talk to the Jews and the Christians who are spread all throughout the Roman Empire about this very issue of how do you try not to discriminate against one group of people versus another, how not to show favorites or play favoritism toward people who maybe look fancy, they look like they have everything together, and those who seem like they're struggling. As we jump in here, let's go ahead and look at our video outline on page 56. The first question we have for us here when it comes to this issue of dealing with those who are in poverty: why do we hesitate to help? Why do we struggle and hesitate to help? We find, first of all, is this: we naturally favor some people over others. We naturally favor some people over others. We look there, James chapter 2, verse 1. Look what James writes. He says, "My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others?" The problem is, we have to work at this and consciously think about how we treat people around us. Are we showing favoritism or discrimination because of what a person looks like? If they don't look like us, sound like us, smell like us, come from a similar background or upbringing as us, if they're not from our area, how do we treat them? How do we approach them? How do we interact with them? Do we write them off? We talked about this, and we'll talk about this in greater detail in the next session when we have the story of the Good Samaritan, where we ask the question, well, who exactly is my neighbor when somebody is dealing with a season of sickness? We find, first of all, because we naturally favor some people over others. The second point there is this: we judge the exterior of people. You've heard the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover. And yet we find in the Old Testament, when Samuel was anointing David as the next king of Israel, the verse comes out that man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And that's true. God does judge us by our hearts, the content of our character, if you will, as Martin Luther King Jr. said. But the idea is this: for many of us, we really judge somebody based on what we see. We judge the exterior. Look what James says in James 2:2. For example, suppose someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes. So he sets up this scenario for us, and he says you have 2 different individuals that come in. The first person, they look like they are doing well for themselves. They have fancy clothes, they have jewelry, they have money, they have some kind of stability and security in their lives. And our natural inclination is to treat them a certain way based on what we see. You have another person who comes in who doesn't look like that at all. They look like they have financial instability. Maybe their clothes look a certain way or they're dressed a certain way, and we automatically judge them. The encouragement, when we see where this is going, James is telling us fight against our natural inclinations to judge somebody by what we see. The third reason why we hesitate to help is this: we have a bias for personal benefit. And this is really where it's driving to. And James calls each one of us and his readers to this issue because we have a natural bias for personal benefit. We look at somebody and we see them either as a friend or a foe, as somebody that can help us or as somebody that could hurt us. And many times we treat people a certain way because we look at, well, how can they benefit us? And so we play the buddy card, quid pro quo. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. We really were wanting to benefit ourselves, because if somebody seems to be famous, if somebody seems to have money, well, what could I get out of this relationship? Attention, financing, whatever it might be. Look what he says, James 2:3-4. If you give special attention and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you stand over there or else sit on the floor. He says, well, doesn't this discrimination show your judgments are guided by evil motives? To understand what he's talking about here is front seats, just like in sports, just like at a concert, they're the most desirable place to be. The most expensive seats, the most desirable place to be are right there up front. For the Jews and their meeting gatherings, they would often meet in a synagogue. They would have a meeting place, and especially according to Jewish tradition, in a room, you imagine a square meeting room where you have a bench lining each of the walls, the three walls. Up front is where the speaker would be. There's no seating behind the speaker, so there are seating on three sides. You have the entrance to the meeting room, and so if people couldn't get in because it was a packed house, there would be standing room only at the doorway, and people would look in through the windows possibly, because in their day it was a Middle Eastern arid area, and so they could be able to look through the windows and kind of listen and hear what was being said. Those who were privileged, those who had some kind of standing or stature in amongst the people, they would be given the front seat to be able to sit, because obviously if you're there for a while, you have somebody, you don't want them sitting on the floor, so the privileged position would be the benches that would be kind of closer to the front on the sides. And then, so he says, you give those people who look good, who have fancy clothes and jewelry, you give them the best seat in the house on a bench toward the front. Those who come in and poor, you say, well, you can stand where there's standing room only, or if you want to, you can actually sit on the floor. In the open area in the middle, they would have a place where people could just sit. Many times it was split down the middle, men on one side, women on the other. And so again, telling somebody who's poor, literally telling them, you can take a posture of being in the lowest position, if you will. In the Roman Empire, where James was writing back in those days, they had a hierarchy system. Caesar, the emperor, he was at the top of the system. Those that would spend time with him, that had authority and privilege and were the Roman elite, they would have money and financing, and it was what could they give to Caesar, what could they get from Caesar. All the way down the ranking, at the lowest place were those who were women, children, those who were slaves, those who were be conquered from other countries. They held the lowest spot, and the poor. So there was really, once you were in that place in life, you really couldn't work your way out. There weren't very many rags to riches stories back in the Roman Empire. This is the situation, this is the culture that James is writing to. So why do we have a personal bias? Why do we have we judge the exterior of people? Why do we favor some people over others? Well, because he says there that we're guided by what? Our motives. And based on how we show discrimination can show whether our motives are evil or whether they're good. So his encouragement, though, he transitions and says, we need to be rich to those who are in poverty. Let's take a look at the next point then as we see this. How to be rich toward those who are in poverty, to the poor. Number 1, see poverty as God sees poverty. James chapter 2, verse 5. Look at what he says there. Listen to me, dear brothers and sisters. Hasn't God chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith? Aren't they the ones who will inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? James chapter 2, verse 5. We find here there's this amazing throwback to the Jesus Sermon on the Mount. So James, half-brother Jesus, says the same concept. He says there in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You say, why would God choose those who are poor in this world, but yet rich in faith? What does that mean? Well, think about who James is talking about in this story. Those who have finances, those who have means and financial stability, For them, worrying about where they're going to sleep or the food that they're going to eat from day to day, for them, that's not a stressor for them. That's not a factor in their life because they know that there's some stability and security there for them. For somebody who's coming from a position of poverty, from day to day, their livelihood is based on their ability to find a place to lay their head, based on their ability to keep themselves warm from the elements, and based on their ability to feed themselves, to take care of themselves, to have something for food, for sustenance from day to day. As we know, much of Jesus' ministry was to those who were really on the fringes, for those who struggled, who were either sick or in poverty, who were possessed, who had all kinds of different things that were going on. In the Roman Empire, taxation was a massive issue. The Romans would tax the people, the Jews as well would tax the people, and so people actually would be taxed out of their homes. If they couldn't pay the tax, they would sell their home. If they continued not to be able to pay the tax, they would sell their business. They would even sell their kids or themselves into servitude so they could go ahead and pay taxes. So the culture that Jesus ministered in and Jesus spoke to and James is speaking into was really a culture of servitude and of heavy oppressive taxation. So you can just imagine the kind of poverty that people would have been in and what they would have faced. We find not only do we need to see poverty as God sees it, that God sees that those people have faith, and here's the key, they have faith to trust God from one day to the next. They have a greater amount of faith. From what we see, what James says, they are rich in their faith toward God, trusting God. That's not to say that people who have money don't trust God, that they don't trust God's provision and God to take care of them. But somebody who is subsisting from one day to the next with absolutely nothing, they have to trust God to take care of them. And so James iterates that point there for us. Number 2, keep the great commandment. He says there in James chapter 2, verse 8, yes, indeed, when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures, love your neighbor as yourself. How do we be rich toward those who are in poverty? It is to see everyone as our neighbor, no matter if they're rich or if they're poor. Either way, we treat them with love and kindness. But especially, James is making this point, not to discriminate against anybody, but especially our tendency is normally to discriminate against those who we see that can't benefit us. And so he says, love them. We find the same question from the lawyer as he asked Jesus, and we'll talk about this in session number 4. Who is my neighbor? We find Cain had the same question from God. And am I my brother's keeper? Am I really responsible to take care of other people? The obvious answer from both Jesus and from God to Cain was, yes, you are responsible to take care of other people. And so we keep the great commandment, as James says here. Number 4, then, we find this: act on your faith impulse right away. Act on your faith impulse right away. James 2:14. So we're going to skip a couple verses from James chapter 2, verse 8, and jump to verse 14. What does he mean there by act on your faith impulse right away? Look at verse 14. What good is it, brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you don't show it by your actions? What kind of faith can that kind of faith save anyone? I've said this before. Many times we will think ourselves out of compassion before we will act on compassion. We will rationalize ourselves, our way out of compassion before we ever go ahead and act on compassion. And it's really hard because we have in our nature, I struggle with, I don't want to be taken advantage of. I don't want to look like a fool. I don't want to help somebody continue on to scam and to be a con artist, if you will. That's kind of the voice in the back of my head sometimes. And I don't want to be gullible or foolish. And so many times when we have that sense, usually we have an impulse of, I should help. Many times my natural inclination, I should help, but I rationalize myself out of helping. And so many times, Amanda and I, we have this kind of thing that we say, do it first, then talk about it. Or do it without thinking. A lot of things in life, that's not a rule of thumb you should hold to. Think about it first, and then do it. Think before you speak. Think before you act, because many bad decisions and many unkind things have been said because somebody didn't think. But when it comes to showing compassion, the encouragement is that sometimes we need to just put our brain on pause and not rationalize ourselves out of it. Now, I will say this. We have to, again, think through, am I showing relief and helping them for a moment, or is this development? Now, if you're in a situation where you're giving somebody relief, you don't know them, it's somebody who's asking for money on the side of the street, whatever it might be, if you can, do what you can, when you can, the best you can, however you can. That's a great rule of thumb to follow. Do what you can. If you can't do anything, no problem. That's okay. You can't get something from nothing. but you give what you can as you have opportunity. If you are in a relationship with somebody who is consistently saying, hey, I'm struggling with finances, I need some money, I need some help out, that takes us into a different realm. And that goes from helping somebody relieve them from a temporary emergency situation, such as situational poverty, where maybe they lose their home, somebody loses their car, they lose a job, maybe they go through a divorce and they're financially impacted by that, or they have a health crisis. Man, that's a situation. But as you have this relationship with them, we have to know, and we'll talk about this in session 5, the difference between development and relief, discipleship and relief. Really what it comes down to, when we struggle and we say, I don't want to, am I enabling somebody? The next step, and this is kind of a side note we'll get into here, there's a book called When Helping Hurts. And so if we continue to enable somebody, that's not helping them to depend on God. That's not helping them to develop their purpose and figure out God's plan for their life. Because ultimately, when you pay it forward to somebody, you want them to pay it forward to somebody else. And so you have to ask God for wisdom here. Am I giving this person relief, or can I help disciple them and help develop them and help them if they're in a situation? And really that's based on a relationship. What kind of relationship do you have? Are they a friend, a family member, or even a child? One of your kids? How can I help them? Great rule of thumb again. Feels like there's a lot of rule of thumbs in this section. Another rule of thumb is this, is don't do for somebody else what they could do for themselves. Now again, you have to have wisdom and discernment here. But when it comes to an ongoing relationship with somebody, if they're continually asking you to do something that they could do for themselves, if they're physically incapable of doing something, that's another story. But if they're asking you to do something that they could do for themselves, that's where you need to ask God for wisdom and say, hey, what can I do to help you take steps to move forward and to develop your faith in God, to develop your abilities, to develop a job opportunity for you? What can I do to help you take that next step? And that's a great way how to help somebody who's struggling, who's in poverty. And again, we just walk through life with people. So I think we've said enough about that. We'll move on then to number 4. We find number 4, follow through on your faith. Follow through on your faith. We see with this, follow through on your faith, verse 15 and 16, we see this. Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing. Now again, take note of this. Circle the word brother or sister. He's not talking about just a blood brother and sister. Now this would apply as well, a family member. But he's talking about, back in those days, they would talk about the family of God, that their people are a part of the family of God. In some churches, they use this kind of verbiage to say, hey, brother, hey, sister so-and-so, hey, sister Lucy or sister Sally or whoever it might be. And so he says, if you see another person who's a believer who has no food or clothing, and you say to them, goodbye, have a good day, stay warm and eat well, he says, but then you don't give that person any food or clothing, what does that do? What good does that do? It's kind of hypocritical. It's like, hey, I see you're hurting, but like, God bless you, go your way. He says, help them out. Be able to help them. Encourage them. One of the challenges for us is this. In our Western mindset, we have very much this sense of, I earned it, I deserve it. I worked for it, I deserve it. I earned it, I deserve it. And we struggle with this thought when Paul writes to the Thessalonians. He says, if you don't work, you don't eat. He says somebody who doesn't provide for their family is worse than somebody who is an infidel. He puts it in those terms, somebody who doesn't follow God. So he says you're just like somebody who is actively opposing God when you don't provide for your family. Now here's the caveat to understand there, the context of that, so we have clarity here with what James is saying. When Paul was writing to the Thessalonians, one of the challenges that they were struggling with was this: when is Jesus coming back? They were really anxious about this issue and nervous about it. And so what was happening for many of those Jews in the church of Thessalonica, who Paul is writing to in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, they were quitting their jobs and they were staying home and they were relying on the rest of the church to provide for them, because their thought was, if Jesus returns, I want to be in prayer and waiting for Jesus. And instead of working a job, I want to just be at home waiting so I'm ready for him to come back. Well, as you know, 2,000 years have passed and Jesus still hasn't come back. That's not to say he can't come back tomorrow. But the challenge was this. Paul was getting feedback from those in the church who were saying, hey, what do we do about this? There are people who are not in the church, who are not believers, who are watching and who can't understand why some Christians aren't working. And that's when Paul says, listen, If you have the ability to work, if you have the ability to provide for yourself and your family, do that. You shouldn't be getting handouts if you can actively go ahead and work. And so we've got to keep that in mind to keep that in balance. But in this case, what we see here is he's saying, if you see somebody who doesn't have something, to ask God for wisdom, and instead of saying, go your way, he says, help them out. Because faith without works is useless, as we'll see in just a moment. We see that phrase at the bottom of the page, do it first, then talk about it. Instead of just letting our words be empty with good intention, let's act on it with compassion and action. Then we see number 5 then. We look, number 5, have a bias toward compassion. Have a bias toward compassion toward action. James 2:17 says this, you see, faith by itself isn't enough unless it produces good deeds. It is dead and useless. It's dead and useless. We're going to talk about this more on Sunday mornings, and so if you're tracking with us and you're watching this and you're not attending Greater Philly, no problem. So I'll throw this little nugget of truth in here for you, and we'll unpack it more in our church service Sunday morning sermons. There is a word in the Old Testament that is what we would use for compassion. Compassion means to suffer with somebody, to relieve their pain, to feel their pain. And that word in the Old Testament, many times used in the book of Psalms, is a word called loving kindness, the loving kindness of the Lord. Well, that concept really doesn't do justice. What exactly is loving kindness? Well, the word for the Hebrews was hesed, and it literally means that by our good deeds we reveal the goodness of God. By our good deeds we reveal the goodness of God. So it's this loving kindness of the Lord that when we do good and we show loving kindness toward others, we show the loving kindness of God to us and to people. Jesus says it this way in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. He says, let your good works, let your good deeds be like a burst of light before all people so that they would see what you're doing, see your good deeds, and then in turn praise your Father in heaven, glorify God, give God the credit in heaven, so that by what we do, it reveals God to other people. This classic scenario. Why do people sometimes say, I like Jesus and I like God, but I'm not so sure about his kids. I'm not so sure about church people. Why? Because there's some expectations to put your money where your mouth is, to not be hypocritical. If you say you care, do you really care? How can you show that you care? Compassion is the bridge. It makes the difference to bringing credibility then to what we say. And that's the issue that James is addressing here. Number 6 then, we see this. Help without hesitation. Help without hesitation. We see James chapter 2, verse 18. He says this, someone may argue, well, some have faith and others have good deeds. But I say, he says, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. There are some people that James was having this conversation with, and their argument was, well, doing things, serving and helping, that's not my gifting. Now, back in the first century, Paul wrote a lot about people's gifting and how God had gifted individuals. And so some people might say, well, my gift is faith. That is my faith. I trust God and I have faith in God. And that may be true. But others may say, well, my gift is serving. And James says, well, if you truly have faith, saving faith, it should be shown in your deeds. To echo what Jesus said in Matthew 5:16, let your good work, let your good deeds be visible for all to see so that people can ultimately glorify God. 2 Corinthians 8:9, look what Paul says there as he echoes this. You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor. Why? So that by his poverty he could make you rich as well. This last statement for us is this from Helen Keller. She says, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. When it comes to helping those who are struggling, we have to have a heart for people, whether it's to relieve temporarily for a moment in an emergency situation, whether it means you see somebody who's sitting at a convenience store or on the side of the road with a cardboard sign and you give them a few dollars, whether it's somebody who you're related to or somebody who lives in your neighborhood or maybe somebody who that you constantly come across their path as you're coming and going and you see that, well, they need help and encouragement. The challenge for us from James and from Jesus is this, is to engage people where they're at, to love them, to do what you can, the best you can, however you can, when you can. And God will give you that understanding and that opportunity. Do the best you can with what you have. Now here's the encouragement is this. You've heard me say this before. You can't give what you don't have. And you say, Pastor Matt, I don't have any money to give to poor people or people struggling in poverty. You say, I just struggle with that. Well, that's true. I don't have the patience to deal with those kind of things. I understand that. That's true. But you don't give what you can't. You can't give what you don't have. And so that's when we have to ask God for His help, because we can give what God does have. And so we ask God to give us wisdom. We ask God to give us patience. We ask God to give us strength. We ask God to, hey, God, can you help me so that I can be a help to other people? If you have a burden to help those who are struggling, those who struggle with poverty, ask God, God bless me so that I can turn around and be a blessing to other people. James says, later on in James chapter 3, he says that you receive not because you ask not, because you ask only to go ahead and benefit yourself. What if our prayer became, God bless me financially so that I can bless those others, so I can bless others financially? Bless me with a promotion. Bless me with a job raise. Bless me so that I can turn around and be a blessing to other people financially. Well, I can go ahead and provide for other people in whatever way I can and give back. I will say this in closing. Helping those who are in poverty and those struggling, it's not just a financial way to help them. And obviously, that's a primary way to be able to help. But also, you can spend your time. Also, you can give toward people things that, well, you don't need anymore. You can go ahead and donate. There are multiple different ways that we can help. There's opportunities where you can volunteer in the community. Volunteer through the church, volunteer and start something where you can go ahead and help people who are struggling with homelessness or food insecurity. You can volunteer in an organization and be able to help that way. And don't do it alone. Maybe it's a project you as a small group work together to do something to be able to make this work. With each one of these situations, one of the challenges for us that we have to fight against when it comes to compassion is to have an us and them mentality. I even hesitated when writing the titles for some of these to say help the poor or care for the sick, because sometimes that can be seen or taken as being a little offensive or derogatory as we talk about different people groups. But the encouragement is this: we are all in this together. All that I am is one poor beggar. I am in need of God, and I'm telling somebody else who is poor, somebody else who needs God, where to find their food and sustenance, where to find help. And I'm pointing them to Jesus, pointing them back to God. And in the process, if I can help them financially, if I can help them with food, I'll do that as well. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to jump into your discussion questions and unpack this more. There's a lot to process and take in, because these are some big concepts to really impact our thinking, how we see people. For your compassion campaign, read down through some of those suggestions and really pray about, God, is this something that you want our small group to do? Is this something that you want our church to do? Is this something you want me, myself, and my family to get involved in and help people to show our faith in a very practical way, that by our good deeds, people will see the goodness of God? Thanks so much for watching.